There is a sound that every negotiator dreads. It is not the sound of a threat. It is not the sound of a fist hitting a table. It is not the sound of a door slamming. It is the sound of silence. The silence that follows when the other side disconnects the call, walks away from the table, and does not look back. At 3:17 p.m. Eastern Standard Time this afternoon, the President of the United States heard that silence. And in that silence, the most important bilateral relationship America has ever had died. Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, sat through 47 minutes of a secure video conference with Donald Trump. He listened. He asked one question. He received an answer that confirmed everything he already suspected. And then he said 8 words that will be studied in diplomatic history for the next century. Canada will not surrender. This call is over. Then the screen went black. And if you think what you are watching right now is a negotiation breakdown, you are not paying attention. Negotiation breakdowns imply that both sides will return to the table. What happened this afternoon is not a breakdown. It is a severance, a permanent, irreversible, structural severing of the relationship that has defined North American security, trade, and stability since 1945. Canada is not waiting for a better offer. Canada is not posturing for leverage. Canada is leaving. And the United States has no mechanism, no leverage, and no strategy to bring it back. In this breakdown, I am going to walk you through exactly what happened in that 47-minute video conference, word by word, demand by demand, and show you the precise moment Trump lost Canada forever. I am going to reveal the internal White House reaction when Carney disconnected and why senior officials are calling this the worst diplomatic failure of Trump's entire presidency. I am going to show you what Carney announced 90 minutes later in Ottawa and why his 6-minute press conference was more devastating than any speech he has ever delivered. I am going to lay out the 4 receipts that prove the consequences are already cascading through markets, alliances, and military structures in real time. I am going to give you the psychological profile comparison that explains why Trump never had a chance of winning this negotiation and why Carney was always going to walk. And I am going to give you 3 scenarios for what North America looks like 6 months from now with no diplomatic relationship between the 2 countries that share the longest undefended border on Earth. Subscribe to join the community, leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video because what happened today will affect your energy bills, your national security, and your economic future starting this week. Let me walk you through that video conference because the details reveal something far more important than who said what. They reveal that the United States still does not understand what it is dealing with. The call was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. It had taken days of back-channel diplomacy to arrange. U.S. officials reached out to Canadian counterparts suggesting that both sides needed to find an off-ramp. Canadian officials agreed to a leaders-level call, not because they expected progress, but because Carney wanted to give Trump one final chance to demonstrate that negotiation was possible. One chance, one call, one opportunity to prove that the United States could treat Canada as something other than a subordinate. The participants tell you how seriously both sides took this. On the U.S. side, Trump, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and several senior White House staff. On the Canadian side, Carney, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, and Defense Minister Bill Blair. This was not a staff-level discussion. This was the full weight of both governments in one room. According to sources present on both sides, Trump opened the call by saying he was ready to make a deal and that both countries needed to, quote, stop this nonsense and get back to normal. Stop this nonsense. That framing tells you everything. Trump characterized a month of sovereignty violations, economic warfare, and alliance destruction as nonsense. As if Canada's fight for independence was a tantrum that needed to end so the adults could get back to business. Trump then laid out what he called a fair compromise, and I need you to listen carefully to what he offered and what he demanded because the asymmetry is staggering. Trump said the United States would remove all tariffs on Canadian goods effective immediately. The U.S. would reaffirm commitment to NORAD and joint continental defense. The U.S. would restore full intelligence sharing through Five Eyes. and the U.S. would issue a statement saying it respects Canadian sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. It sounds like the U.S. is giving Canada what it asked for. Remove the tariffs, recommit to defense, restore intelligence, acknowledge sovereignty, but then came the price tag. Trump said Canada had to do 3 things in exchange. First, reverse the financial restrictions on U.S. banks that Canada imposed last week, and commit to never imposing similar restrictions in the future. In other words, Canada must disarm the single most effective economic weapon it deployed during this crisis and promise to never build another one. Second, sign a 10-year energy export agreement guaranteeing minimum supply levels to the United States at market prices without restriction. In other words, Canada must lock itself into a decade-long commitment to supply American energy needs regardless of how the United States treats Canada during those 10 years. Canada must guarantee supply. The United States must guarantee nothing. Third, withdraw from the Alternative Security Partnership Fund that NATO approved and commit to working exclusively through traditional NATO structures where the U.S. has more influence. In other words, Canada must abandon the independent security framework it just built with European allies, the framework that proved Canada does not need American military protection, and return to a structure where the United States controls the agenda. Let me translate what Trump actually proposed. He said, "I will stop hitting you if you hand me all your weapons, chain yourself to my economy for 10 years, and abandon the allies who protected you when I threatened you." That is not a compromise. That is a demand for unconditional surrender dressed up in diplomatic language. And Carney saw through it in seconds. According to sources, Carney listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. When Trump finished, Carney asked a single question. One question, precise, surgical, designed to strip away the diplomatic pretense and reveal the true nature of what was being offered. He said, "Mr. President, are you offering to negotiate these terms, or are you presenting them as non-negotiable conditions?" That question was a test. If Trump said these were starting points for negotiation, there was room to work. If Trump said these were final terms, Carney already knew what he would do. Trump reportedly responded, "These are the terms. Take it or leave it. But if you leave it, things are going to get a lot worse for Canada." Take it or leave it. A threat appended to an ultimatum, delivered to a sovereign nation that has spent a month proving it cannot be threatened. Carney then spoke for approximately 3 minutes. According to multiple sources who heard his remarks, this is what he said. "Mr. President, Canada has spent the last month demonstrating that we can withstand pressure, that we can build alternative partnerships, and that we do not depend on American approval to defend our interests. You are asking us to give up every tool we have developed to protect Canadian sovereignty in exchange for commitments you have already violated multiple times." He continued, "You want us to trust you after you questioned whether Canadian provinces should remain part of Canada. You want us to lock in energy exports after you threatened our economic security. You want us to abandon security arrangements with allies who supported us when you threatened to dismantle NORAD." Then the verdict. None of that is reasonable. That is not compromise. That is surrender, and Canada will not surrender. Then silence. Then the click. Then the black screen. And then the 8 most consequential words of this entire crisis. This call is over. Now let me show you what happened in Washington after that screen went dark, because the reaction inside the White House tells you that even they know this is a catastrophe. According to sources, when Carney disconnected, there was complete silence in the White House Situation Room for several seconds. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The most powerful people in the American government sat and stared at a blank screen. Trump reportedly broke the silence by saying, "He hung up on me. Not an analysis, not a strategy, not a next step, just the raw, unprocessed disbelief of a man who has spent his entire career believing that nobody walks away from him." Trump then asked his advisors whether they could reconnect the call. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States was just told by a sovereign nation that negotiations are over, and his first instinct was to call back, like a rejected phone salesman pressing redial. The National Security Advisor had to explain that Carney had intentionally ended the call and that attempting to reconnect without Canadian consent would be diplomatically inappropriate. Trump reportedly became angry. He said, "Call him back. Tell him if he doesn't negotiate, I'm cutting off all trade, all energy, everything. And here is where the room went cold. Because the Secretary of State had to explain to the President of the United States that America cannot unilaterally cut off all trade with Canada without congressional approval. And doing so would devastate the American economy, not the Canadian economy. The U.S. needs Canadian energy. The U.S. needs Canadian raw materials. The U.S. needs cross-border supply chains that employ millions of American workers. Trump reportedly responded with the question that every advisor in that room had been dreading. Then what can I do? And the answer, according to sources, was essentially nothing. Nothing. The President of the United States sitting in the Situation Room surrounded by the full apparatus of American power, and the answer to his question was nothing. The United States has exhausted its leverage. Every tariff is already in place. Every threat has already been made. And Canada has already built alternatives to every single thing the United States provides. You cannot threaten someone who is already prepared for the worst. You cannot pressure someone who has already absorbed the pain and come out stronger. You cannot negotiate with someone who has concluded that negotiation with you is pointless. And Carney has concluded exactly that, not because he is unwilling to negotiate, but because he has learned over 5 weeks of crisis that Trump does not negotiate. Trump dictates, Trump threatens, Trump demands, and when the other side does not comply, Trump escalates. There is no version of negotiation with this president that ends in mutual compromise because Trump views compromise as weakness and weakness as unacceptable. Carney figured that out. And he walked. Now let me show you what happened 90 minutes later in Ottawa, because Carney's press conference was not a reaction. It was a declaration of independence. At 4:47 p.m., Carney stood at a podium in the National Press Theatre. He spoke for less than 6 minutes. He took no questions. And in those 6 minutes, he dismantled the last remaining possibility that the U.S.-Canada relationship could be repaired under this administration. Carney said, "This afternoon, I participated in a call with President Trump to explore whether negotiation could resolve the current crisis. I concluded that negotiation is not possible with the current U.S. administration because the United States is not seeking compromise. The United States is seeking Canadian capitulation. Canada will not capitulate." Then the announcements, each one a nail in the coffin. Canada will suspend all negotiations with the United States indefinitely. Not pause, not delay, suspend indefinitely. There is no next call scheduled. There is no back channel open. There is no envoy appointed. The diplomatic machinery between the two countries has been shut down. Canada will proceed with building independent security capabilities using support from NATO allies through the Alternative Security Partnership Fund. The $8.2 billion security framework that the United States demanded Canada abandon is now Canada's primary defense strategy. Canada is not going back to NORAD dependence. Canada is building something new. Canada will diversify energy export markets and reduce dependence on U.S. buyers. The pipelines that flow south are going to be redirected west. The oil that fueled American refineries is going to fuel Asian and European economies instead. The energy relationship that has defined continental economics for half a century is being unwound. Canada will strengthen financial regulations to protect Canadian economic stability from external policy volatility. Translation: the financial restrictions on U.S. banks are not being reversed. They are being expanded. Canada is building an economic firewall against American interference, and every brick in that wall makes reconnection harder. Canada will work with partners in Europe, Asia, and across the Commonwealth to build relationships based on mutual respect, not on coercion. Then Carney closed with a statement that was as elegant as it was devastating. Canada does not seek confrontation. We seek partnership, but partnership requires treating Canada as an equal, not as a subordinate. When the United States is ready to engage on that basis, Canada will be ready to talk. Until then, Canada is moving forward. We will not wait for American permission to defend our interests or to build our future. 6 minutes, no questions. He delivered his statement and left. And in those 6 minutes, he accomplished something that no foreign leader has managed in the modern era. He defined the terms on which the United States must approach him, not the other way around. He positioned Canada as the reasonable party and the United States as the obstacle. He signaled to every ally watching that independence from Washington is not only possible, but preferable. And he did it with the calm, measured precision of a central banker explaining a rate decision, not a politician performing outrage. That is what control looks like. That is what leverage looks like when it is held by someone who knows exactly how to use it. Receipt number 1. The market reaction. Within minutes of Carney's press conference, markets delivered their verdict on who won this confrontation, and the verdict was unanimous. The Canadian dollar strengthened 1.7% against the US dollar, not weakened, strengthened. Currency traders, the most coldly rational participants in global markets, looked at a country that just severed its relationship with the world's largest economy and decided that country's currency was worth more, not less. That tells you everything about who the market believes is on the right side of this divide. U.S. energy stocks fell sharply as traders priced in the near certainty that Canadian energy exports will be redirected to non-U.S. markets. If you own energy stocks tied to Canadian supply, today was a very bad day, and the days ahead will be worse. Midwest utility stocks dropped as traders recognized that electricity supply from Canadian hydroelectric generation is now officially uncertain. Those utilities have no backup plan. They have no alternative source that can match Canadian hydroelectric output. When those supply contracts expire or are not renewed, electricity prices in the American Midwest will spike, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. The S&P 500 fell 2.3%. Not because of one sector, not because of one company, because investors concluded that the largest trading relationship the United States has is broken with no clear path to repair. That 2.3% represents hundreds of billions of dollars in value evaporating because one man could not treat a neighboring country with basic respect. The market is not political. The market does not care about sovereignty speeches or patriotic rhetoric. The market cares about cash flows, supply chains, and risk. And the market just told you that the risk of U.S.-Canada permanent estrangement is being priced into every American asset. Receipt number 2, the European response. Within 2 hours, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement. 3 of America's oldest and most important allies speaking with one voice. The statement said, "We understand and respect Canada's decision to suspend negotiations given the lack of good faith engagement from the United States. We stand ready to deepen our partnerships with Canada in defense, trade, and economic cooperation." Read that again. 3 major European powers publicly stated that the United States did not engage in good faith. They did not say both sides need to compromise. They did not call for dialogue. They said the U.S. failed and they are siding with Canada. That is not diplomatic boilerplate. That is an alignment decision. Europe has looked at this crisis and decided that Canada is the reliable partner and the United States is not. And that alignment decision will have consequences far beyond this specific dispute because it signals to every country in the world that opposing the United States no longer means standing alone. It means joining a coalition that includes Europe's largest economies and most capable militaries. Canada walked away from Trump, and Europe walked with Canada. Receipt number 3, the NATO transformation. Canada's announcement that it will proceed with building independent security capabilities through the Alternative Security Partnership Fund is not just about Canada. It is about what NATO becomes when its most powerful member can no longer be trusted. According to NATO sources, Canada's $8.2 billion funding request will be approved within 72 hours. Not weeks, not months, 72 hours. Because every NATO member understands that Canada's request is not really about Canada. It is about establishing the precedent that NATO can function as a security provider independent of American leadership. Once that precedent is set, it cannot be unset. Every NATO member that faces U.S. pressure, every NATO member that disagrees with American policy, every NATO member that worries about American reliability will know that there is an alternative, a NATO mechanism that provides security without requiring American approval. The Alternative Security Partnership Fund was designed to address exactly this scenario. a scenario in which the United States becomes a source of instability rather than a guarantor of stability. Canada's decision to activate that fund to become its first beneficiary, to build an entire defense architecture around it, transforms NATO from an American-led alliance into a multilateral security framework where American participation is welcome but not required. That transformation has been theorized about for decades. Today, it became real. Receipt number 4, the energy reconfiguration. This is the receipt that will hit American wallets hardest and last longest. Canada's commitment to diversify energy export markets is not a negotiating position. It is an infrastructure project already underway. According to energy industry sources, Canada is in advanced negotiations with China, Japan, South Korea, and Germany on long-term supply agreements. These are not preliminary discussions. These are contract negotiations with specific volumes, prices, and delivery timelines. Asian buyers are offering premium prices for guaranteed Canadian supply. Why? Because Canadian energy is more reliable than Middle Eastern alternatives. It is less geopolitically risky than Russian supply, and it comes from a democratic country with transparent regulatory systems and enforceable contracts. For Asian energy importers, Canada is the ideal supplier, and until now, Canada was unavailable because all its energy flowed south. Trump just made Canada available. If Canada signs these agreements, and every indication says it will within weeks, Canadian energy infrastructure will be permanently reconfigured. Pipelines will be built west to Pacific ports. LNG terminals will be expanded. Shipping routes will be established. And once that infrastructure exists, it does not get dismantled because a future American president asks nicely. Infrastructure creates path dependence. Once the oil flows west, it keeps flowing west. The United States will face permanent reduction in Canadian energy imports, not temporary, permanent, and replacement supply will come from more expensive, less reliable sources. Your energy bills are going up, not because of a policy decision you can reverse, because of an infrastructure decision that cannot be reversed. Now let me give you the psychological profile comparison because it explains why this outcome was inevitable from the moment Trump picked this fight. Donald Trump negotiates through dominance. His method is to establish psychological superiority, make demands from a position of assumed strength, and use threats to compel compliance. This approach works against parties who believe they have no alternative. It works against contractors who need to be paid. It works against smaller companies that cannot afford litigation. It works against individuals who fear public confrontation. It does not work against Mark Carney. Carney is a former central banker. He ran the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis and then ran the Bank of England during Brexit. He has managed two of the most significant economic crises of the 21st century. He has sat across the table from every major financial power on earth. He has navigated situations where the wrong decision would have collapsed entire national economies. Trump threatens, Carney calculates, Trump demands, Carney models scenarios, Trump escalates, Carney builds alternatives. Trump's fundamental error in this crisis was assuming that Canada had no alternative to American partnership. That assumption was wrong when the crisis began, and it became more wrong every single day as Carney systematically constructed alternatives in energy, defense, finance, and diplomacy. By the time Trump sat down for that video conference this afternoon, Carney had already built everything Canada needed to walk away. The energy diversification was in progress. The NATO security framework was funded. The European alliances were solidified. The financial protections were in place. Trump walked into that call believing he was making a generous offer to a country that had no choice but to accept. Carney walked into that call knowing he had already built the exit and was simply giving Trump one last chance to provide a reason not to use it. Trump gave him no reason, so Carney used it. He did not hang up in anger. He did not hang up in frustration. He hung up because he had completed his assessment. He had confirmed that Trump would not negotiate in good faith. He had confirmed that the terms being offered were surrender terms, and he had confirmed that Canada's alternatives were strong enough to sustain an indefinite break. He hung up because there was nothing left to learn from the call. That is the difference between a negotiator who operates on emotion and a negotiator who operates on information. Trump was performing dominance, Carney was conducting due diligence. And when the due diligence confirmed what the models predicted, Carney executed the decision he had already prepared for. Chess versus checkers does not begin to describe the gap. This was algorithmic game theory versus schoolyard intimidation. And the algorithm won. Now let me give you the economic consequences in detail because the numbers are not abstract. They will show up in your life. The State Department memo prepared after the call collapse outlines the long-term cost of permanent U.S.-Canada estrangement. Loss of intelligence sharing will require the United States to build independent surveillance and monitoring capabilities for the northern border and the Arctic. Estimated cost, $12 to $18 billion annually. Increased border security costs as the longest undefended border in the world becomes a monitored and potentially militarized boundary. Estimated cost, $8 to $14 billion annually. Economic decoupling that will reduce U.S. GDP by an estimated 0.7% annually. On an economy of $28 trillion, that is $196 billion per year in lost economic output. Energy replacement costs as American utilities and refineries source supply from more expensive, less proximate providers. Estimated cost to American consumers, $340 to $620 per household per year in higher energy bills. Total estimated annual cost of losing Canada as a partner, between $230 billion and $250 billion per year, every year, indefinitely. That is the price of take it or leave it. That is the price of treating your most important partner as a subordinate. That is the price of hanging up on by a country you assumed had no choice. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what North America looks like 6 months from now. Scenario 1, the frozen continent. The U.S. and Canada maintain minimal contact. Trade continues at reduced levels because private companies still need cross-border commerce, but government-to-government cooperation is essentially zero. NORAD operates at minimal capacity with both sides maintaining only the bare minimum required to prevent immediate security gaps. Intelligence sharing is suspended. The border becomes increasingly monitored and bureaucratized. Crossing times increase. Trade volumes decrease. Both economies suffer, but Canada suffers less because it has diversified successfully while the United States has not found replacements. The relationship remains frozen until a new U.S. administration takes office. If that takes 2 years, North America loses 2 years of economic growth, 2 years of security cooperation, and 2 years of the partnership that made both countries safer and more prosperous. Probability, 45%. This is the default outcome if nothing changes. It requires no dramatic action from either side and simply follows the current trajectory of estrangement.